is that the people on stage, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, are completely surrounded, right? And so I have Peter on my left, we have Yulkendy over here, John and Zabeen. Their bios are in your booklet, so I don't need to introduce them. And my name is Scott. The other bad news is that because I can see all of you, I know where you are. And I'm expecting you to be fully active in this conversation. I'm going to call you out. I'm not afraid. I know many of your names. I'm not afraid to call you out. This doesn't work. The 360, if it's just the five of us on the stage speaking, nothing works. So I'm expecting you to be active. We'll start up here, but we'll get to you as quickly as we can. Because that is what we're trying to accomplish, is a truly inclusive conversation. Now, for those of you for whom this is their first 6 Degrees event, the comparison I was thinking of last night was that the symposium, the St. Gallen Symposium, was a fox. It covered breadth, covered a multitude of topics from many different angles. Today, the 360s and 6 Degrees, it's a hedgehog. We're focusing on one big thing, one big idea. And that idea for us is, how do we build a truly inclusive society? How do we reform structures that were built by one group of people for one group of people? So we're going to get right into it.
Scott, you should introduce the 2 people on the mics.
Oh yes, I should also introduce the 2 people on the mics. If they would stand up and identify themselves. I see Upcar Aurora over here. He's holding up the catchbox. And Marty Cates, who you've already met.
So Upcar is the one who hasn't been introduced, that people don't know.
Oh,
for those of you downstairs who were with me in the coffee houses, Upcar is a board member of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and one of the most innovative finance thinkers in Canada. And we were delighted to have him all the way from Toronto. So I'm going to start by actually showing how this works. Where's Yasmin? This, just a gentle toss. Heck, Yasmin, can you speak?
I mean, yeah, wow.
I want you to hold it just below your chin, like a beard. Okay.
Like it's golden.
Let's get straight into it, Yasmin. The next question is coming to you after I talk to the folks on stage, so pay attention.
Yes, sir.
This is about diverse economies. This is about how do we enable ourselves to be equipped for a diverse economy in the 21st century. Now, I also can tell you what it's not about. This is not a conversation about Canada, even though I have a Canadian accent. We're not talking just about Canada, despite my great love for my country. It is also not about migration. It's not about the 65 million people who are moving around this world, though it is related and very important. It's not the prime focus of today's conversation. And the third thing is not about integration, and we'll get into the language and the nuance of integration for reasons that I'm sure will come up again and again. We find the idea of integration to be quite problematic because it assumes that we know who we're integrating into what they are integrating, and that the assumption that they actually know that a culture or a society is static. Let me pick an example. Germany 80 years ago was very different than Germany today. Right? So if you can talk about integration in Germany 80 years ago, you wouldn't be able to have the same conversation today. So my final thought as your host is that only citizenship, true, actual citizenship, enables economic contribution for all. When you deny citizenship to newcomers, when you deny citizenship to those that are new arrivals in your country, you're making it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to fully contribute. You're disabling them and disenfranchising them, and frankly, you're actually hurting yourself. So that's my provocation. We're going to start with Peter over here. Are diverse economies stronger? Yes or no?
The answer is yes, but let me take it from a business perspective, because that's my role. A business is the reflection of society, and therefore an inclusive culture you need in a company to succeed. Therefore, you need an inclusive leadership style, and you need accountability at whatever level you have in the organization. It's also your customers do reflect your society at the end of the day. your end customer, and hence, again, there is a direct link into the company. So if as a leader, if you don't walk the talk about inclusiveness and diversity, you will not be a successful leader, because it's proven that the performance of any company is better if you have diversity and inclusion embedded in the cultural values of the company.
I'm going to take that as a yes.
That's what I said first. So.
Yulkendy, are diverse economies stronger?
Yes, and not only stronger, but resilience. And I think we talked a lot about the need for resilience in the future as we adapt to change. And I'm from the US, and by 2044, the majority of people will look like me. And change is coming. If as a company, I'm also going to talk from a business perspective, because that's my world. If we're not ready to serve the future customers, we're just not going to make money. Economies will suffer. And all of us here will start intermingling, making babies. We're going to be more multiracial, more multi-ethnic than ever. There's a lot of love in the world. And so if you want to feed the babies of the future, we just got to get ready and thrive in this new inclusive world.
Feed the babies of the future. Zabeen, what do you think?
We know the answer is yes, and looking at it through the business lens, I couldn't agree more. To serve the market, you need to hire the market. To understand your customers, and to understand it, we talk a lot about things like empathy and design thinking. Well, what better way to actually bring in people who can really see things through a very different lens? There are lots of studies that have been done. There was one recently done in Canada, and I know this isn't about Canada, but I think would play out, is where we saw that a more diverse companies, actually there was the correlation between revenues and the diversity of the firms. And you see that creativity, that innovation, but it only happens, as Peter says, when you have leaders who have inclusive behaviors to really unleash the potential of that diversity.
Great. Last word to you, John.
Well, it's all yes, but I think that there's something very important, which is, everybody knows what emoji is the word, right? And so smiles and things like that. And it creates this impression that, societies are about happiness, which is really nonsense. And, corporations, like all societies, do better if there's a level of discomfort. It's living with tension, positive tension, and, imagination, creating new products, new relationships between citizens, all based on the capacity to live with a certain level of discomfort. Dictatorships have happy and unhappy people because you're not supposed to be uncomfortable in a dictatorship. So it comes back to your thing. For a corporation to work well, it's got to have that kind of tension in it, which is a form of inclusivity. And then the one Canadian, I've seen many studies on it, but we did the 6 Degrees did a study 2 years ago, and it showed statistically, just to be boring, that well, first of all, 86% of immigrants to Canada become citizens within 5 years. So the faster you're a citizen, the more you're willing to express discomfort, because you're not going to be thrown out. But what the numbers showed was that within 7 years, the percentage of new Canadians likely to start and own a corporation was higher than the percentage of people born in the country. It's within 7 years, which is astonishing. And that's the answer of what drives a marketplace.
So if I take your word of discomfort, the way we translated that into the business was actually to have the challenges you always have in a company, but then bridge them into opportunities. And that's where the inclusive behaviors will actually flourish, if you can build that bridge. So I think we all do that in our daily lives as well in the business. Take the discomfort, but help them to overcome it.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add into that is that so much of what makes society interesting, whether it's business or arts or government or administration, is imagination. And if you have too much comfort and self-satisfaction and similarity, you're not encouraging imagination. And that's when things get locked down and become predictable and not helpful for the economy or for anything, frankly.
I mean, groupthink is really the kiss of death, isn't
Kiss
it?
of death, groupthink, yeah.
Well, I have a handheld mic because I already managed to break my other one. You all look very comfortable, so I'm going to ask you to all stand up. Not in a moment. The question I have for you right now, how many of you do not live in the country in which you were born? Just I'm going to ask, you're going to stand up, on your feet. All of you who do not live in a country in which you were born. My next question, are you an immigrant or are you an expat? If you're an immigrant, stay standing.
I mean, what is the difference?
What is an immigrant?
What is an immigrant?
Yasmin,
What is an immigrant?
Tell it,
What is an
Very
immigrant?
loaded.
what is the
distinction.
difference? You have a mic in your hand.
Hey, actually, firstly, I wanted to respond to what was said in that little, because so Peter, you said that people should walk the talk, right? So I looked up the chairman of the board of directors of ABB, and you have one person of color and 2 women out of 11. So I'm not really sure what walking the talk is, but I think that's quite different. And you also talked about being uncomfortable, so that's what I'm here to make everyone do.
You can all sit down now. Yasmin, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a black Muslim woman. My entire life is kind of like a diversity person. And I also used to work for Shell as a drilling engineer. And the board of directors of Shell, slightly better, 40% women, dope. The executive committee, however, where most of the power is 1 woman and 1 person of color. And given the fact that you operate in a lot of countries that aren't European, I think the challenge is that you don't get... people don't call executives out on this, and you have no accountability, really, because the shareholders oftentimes are people that are benefiting from the same system, right, and aren't really interested in challenging the status quo. And even the question about am I an immigrant or am I an expat, I think, is one that is defined by somebody whose interests are different to mine. And if the conversation really is about diversity and inclusion, it should be about how do we distribute power more effectively rather than how do we wait for some people to hand us something else, because that was colonization.
Well, let's come back to that question of how do we distribute power differently, right? But before we move on...
So if I could just disagree with one thing you said. I think what you're saying is absolutely right if the road to citizenship is not clear. But if,
I mean, why do you assume that I want to be a citizen?
well, then you decide to be something else. But in many countries, people, frankly, you also have to be very careful about whether any of us is speaking as a small group of elite, whatever our colors, versus the mass of the population. I can tell you that of the 300 to 320,000 people who immigrate to Canada every year, 98% of them want to be citizens.
Sure.
And because they want safety and they want security, and then they can travel and do whatever they want anywhere in the world. But they're escaping or changing their lives, which takes an enormous amount of courage. I didn't have to show that kind of courage. I was born there. They're showing the courage by coming to a new place.
My challenge to you would be...
I'm going to elbow my way in as the host of this.
Good luck.
Yulkendy,
And sorry, and the last thing is, I would say, and I say all the time, which is, if I take the top 10 noble words in Canada, like the French would say, liberté, égalité, fraternité,
Wait.
I would put as number 1 or 2, immigrant.
Okay,
It's a
so
noble word.
my challenge to that, if I may...
Yasmin, I'm going to pause us there. It's an
All right.
important conversation.
It's not migrant.
We're only an hour from lunch. Yulkendy.
Yeah, because clearly men can talk more, right? And take the floor.
What I would elaborate is that, so I got a U.S. passport, right? That doesn't stop me or my younger brothers who are U.S. citizen by being shot by the police,
Oh, absolutely.
by not getting an opportunity. Citizenship is not the end goal. Definitely it is a mechanism for that safety, that security, but people do not want it as the end goal. What they want is to be seen, heard, valued, and recognized.
Totally.
They want to get promoted.
Totally.
They want to get opportunity. So I think what you're saying is that let's take it past the next level, because citizenship is only a small bucket of a
All right.
solution.
Citizenship is a small bucket. I'm going to ask, is there anyone here who's brave, and they have to be very brave after what the conversation we've just had, who would argue that diverse economies are actually harmful, that it's better to work with people from similar backgrounds because you understand each other, right? If you went to Yale and your friend went to Harvard, you can work together because you speak the same language, the same jargon. Is there anyone who wants to take that on?
I'll be nice.
Over here. Yaz, can you throw the mic, or we could do it too.
Almost got it.
Yanis, what do you think?
There is research about this. I mean, somebody on Wednesday night, I think, he was talking about some Google project which actually showed that homogeneity in a group is good for in-group trust. And there's lots of research about that trust is induced by homogeneity in general. So diversity itself should not be a goal because you are, thinking about better, like working together, like better economic results. It should be like a moral goal if you care about this, because it creates tension. And I mean, the people around here, if you talk to each other, we actually understand each other quite well because we have a very similar educational background. I watch the same shows like Big Bang Theory, right? We all watch this, so we understand each other. And if you go away from this and you think about people who did not get to go to university and who have a very different upbringing than us, talking to each other is very, very difficult. And this transcends color or whatever.
Thank you. All right, Peter, and then I'm going to go to Zabeen as well.
Okay, let me just throw another one in. We have also to be careful that we don't take diversity and inclusion and then break it only down to people of color or women. You also have to make sure you have got the right skill sets in a company and you have got your market represented, etc. So what I don't really want to do when I run big corporations is to go down and only deal with two issues, because that's not what it is.
So what else should you deal with?
You need to have, in my opinion, if you are a technology company, you will not get around to have the right engineers. Now, if I have a Chinese female engineer, that's the lottery for me, because I have everything covered. Now, that may not always be available immediately, but still you need to run your business. So inclusion for me and diversity is something you manage over, you manage the pipeline and you manage it over time. But you cannot just take a snapshot and therefore decide or kind of take a view that a company or an individual, therefore, is not performing. So we need to be careful. I was in a discussion a few weeks ago. I was completely shocked. It was around how companies do react on Me Too. And there are US corporations now who do no longer allow a man and a woman to have a meeting behind closed doors. Now, I find this absolutely ludicrous. So be careful that we don't go, I do agree, but we should not throw it out of the window. That's what we have achieved over the last few decades. So we need to be careful on this one. And as a leader, you have that responsibility. And I think, therefore, it's a little bit of wider discussion than just nailing it with a few numbers and a few kind of narrow views.
I should mention that Peter's too nice to humble brag, but he is also the chairman of Catalyst, which is a worldwide organization that looks at promoting women in leadership. Zabeen, what do you think?
So just back on the point that Yanis raised, I think that's sort of half the situation. When you have diverse teams, you have to do things to make it an inclusive environment. Yes, it takes work. It takes work to take the time up front, to understand people better, to build that trust. And I think what we forget often with diversity is it's not just about differences. There are similarities that unite us, and there are differences that we bring that really make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And you need to be prepared for that upfront investment in order to get the value from that creativity, from that innovation. And that sometimes, I think it's an important point to raise, because we don't always talk about that, and it can be uncomfortable as you do that discovery and bring that together. I would say, I think there's a lot of evidence, and to some way, and I think in some ways it's also intuitive that when you bring different perspectives, different ideas, you can create things you never knew you'd be able to.
I'm seeing a couple of people nod that it is intuitive. Upcar, yeah. Celia.
Well, I'm Celia. I don't know if I should. I'm going to stand because I like to move. Okay, I'm Celia, I'm from Mexico. And to me, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit too fundamental or too utopic, but to me, even just saying the word inclusion is accepting exclusion first. So inclusion shouldn't be necessary. It should just be the way it is, you know? So, and because when the word inclusion comes up to enterprise and business, it becomes a quota, it becomes a number, a statistic. And then you fulfill that, but in real life, you could do that in your business and you say like, yeah, I got like 2 women, and, you know, interracial and everything, and you go home. And what do? How do you act with people that serve in certain places that are underemployed, you know, that because that is a huge factor, and I see that a lot, of Mexicans in the United States that are amazing people, and I see a lot of Southern Americans that are in Mexico that are like PhD people, doctors, masters, and you know, that there's a lot of things that when you come to inclusion, so to me the question is, when are we going to stop talking about quota and actually being like moral about it and actually taking it to account and just living by it? So
let's get to moral in just 5 minutes. Anna over here in the front row was actually telling me a story, and Anna, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you wouldn't mind telling us the story, sharing the story you told me earlier, I think it'd be quite interesting for everyone here.
Yeah, so I'm Saul, so you can see me, everyone. So, hi, my name is Anna. I'm studying now here at the University of St. Gallen, doing my master here. And my story is that I'm an immigrant myself. I migrated from Ukraine to Germany at the age of 6, but that's not a story about me. It's more a story about my mom. So, also, as you pointed out, I directly identified myself. So, in Ukraine, she was working as an engineer. And she had her diploma, and she came to Germany, and she was expected to continue working because she finished university. She was very good in her field. And she was told, well, sorry, we don't acknowledge your diploma. You have to do everything again in German. So put at the age of 36 in a completely new country, she had to learn the language first and then to pass her exams. And, well, now she's working at the university at RWTH Aachen. So now she got back her position, her reputation, but it took her a lot of time and effort. So that's why I have all the respect about people who are that brave, especially thinking about their children to move out of the country and to start a completely new journey, not knowing whether it's going to be successful and really to make a big sacrifice.
So I'll just jump in there because the time she took to learn a new language and the time she took to retool and retrain, that's time that she wasn't at her full potential. Yeah. And I think that's deeply problematic, and I'm seeing a lot of nods with that. Riz, and then we're going to come back to the folks on the stage.
Sorry, I don't understand. I understood completely what you said.
Yeah.
I mean, the credentials question is one of the biggest problems out there that countries are preventing people who arrive and have interesting things from doing what they can do. But I'm not sure how that applies to what you said, which is the language. If you're going to be an engineer or a doctor, don't you need the language? Because that's who you're serving in that area. You can't stand up in, I don't know, middle of Paris and say, I'm going to now build your building in Ukrainian.
Well, that's the thing, like, she was fluent in English, like, for all the time, so normally, nowadays, like, in our community, I mean, look at us now, like, from all the different nations, you should expect that that's just a basic point, that once you speak English, you can work in an international community. So she was never expected to work in a small company, so that was just the point, and now she tells me, it's so funny, I mean, she tells me, like, I speak German, I'm fluent, but at work, I use it maybe to talk to the postman. Oh. That's it.
Over here, Aya.
Okay. Oh, I like this. So I think I signed up. Okay. You've been talking a lot about let's be careful about this and that. So I think we should be careful about language as well, because we always say like manage diversity and manage this, and we turn it into a corporation kind of discussion. And I see business perspective in this round. I think we shouldn't be managing diversity, we should be engaging with the complexities of diversity, so that's a better way maybe to put it. The second thing, I think the fundamental question is about the privilege of accessibility. So when you say you would not look for diversity of people of color or age or gender, then you ignore the fundamental structure of society that excludes people from access to education, access to services, access to the internet. we talk a lot about the digital revolution, but internet is privileged, is closed, is elitist, and many people don't have, 70% of Africa doesn't have access to internet. So I think instead of saying I should not be looking for this or that as a business, you should be able to recognize the fundamental power and construction of society that make exclusion possible. And your role is to give access to people opportunities.
Riz, I see that the box clashes with the shirt.
I love these. I think actually these should be issued to BBC and CNN reporters. Much easier.
Brevity is beautiful.
I'll recommend it. So I'm Riz Khan. I'm actually now about 11 times at the forum here. I'll be the old fart dancing badly at 2 a.m. at the student party tonight, by the way. At least that might be the perception. I perceive it differently. And what's interesting is we talked a little bit in the coffee house about diversity and the definition of diversity. And I thought one word that doesn't come much into play is perception. Because the funny thing was, I was the first person of South Asian background on mainstream news at the BBC and at CNN. Actually, now it's almost everyone is of Indian, Pakistani, whatever background. But the interesting thing is, I was perceived, when I joined the BBC, as, I guess, safe, British sounding, and everyone at the BBC, irrespective of how they looked at that time, had to sound a certain way. So I was perceived a certain way. And I realized that when people asked me, what's your background? That was one of the big curiosities. What's your background? Depending on how I answered, defined how people perceived me. If I said I'm half Indian, half Pakistani, that's a certain perception. To me, that's almost like a political definition of what I am. I was born in Yemen, but I'm not Arab. Although when I went to Britain at the age of 4, I was considered the Arab boy because I'd come from the Middle East. I consider myself very British because I'm very much Monty Python and long live the Queen. And yet I have Asian roots, South Asian roots. So what I found, and I live in between Dubai and DC, so it's even more interesting because Dubai, I couldn't be a citizen there anyway.
That's right.
But the point being, though, perception is something that's very important. And often when people want to define themselves, they don't often take into account how they might be perceived. I mean, everyone's entitled to be perceived how they want to a certain degree, but we can't control it. So I always think we should also think about perception as one of those things when we discuss diversity, because it's easy to build prejudices into our perceptions. Thank you.
So there's a couple of things that I was hearing, and I want to bring it back to the folks on stage because they also have a lot to contribute here. The question, the moral argument for inclusive economies came up. So there were some over here, some over there, not quadrants, or 33%. John, the moral argument for inclusive economies, why does that exist? Why shouldn't we just focus on the money and the balance sheet?
So I'm the non-business person up here. Are you a non-business person? Are there two of us? You're a business person.
I'm not, but I work
But don't assume businesses don't.
No, I'm just saying. I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
You're all citizens, so go on.
Just as a writer, I have to say that there's a big difference between moral and ethics. I mean, to be pedantic, and I think that moral tends to be more like religion. It is attached much more to prejudice, whereas ethics is something which is not measurable, but which is actually, I think, what we're referring to as ethical behavior. And what you were referring to is partly ethical behavior, not moral behavior. I mean, in total and utter agreement with you. If you're a citizen, even if you weren't a citizen, they still don't have the right to be shooting you or whatever they're doing or treating you differently. So I think that the ethical element is something which can be built into economies and has not been built in enough. And interestingly enough, you know, in the Italian city-states in the Renaissance, for all their flaws, they actually had ethical structures built into the corporations, the guilds, to force their members to act in an ethical way. Very limited by our standards. But I mean, so we haven't done enough of that. I don't think we've done nearly enough of that. And it's not setting quotas. I mean, I totally agree. I've forgotten who talked about the quotas. Was it you talked about quotas, or is? Yeah. I mean, you know, the quota road is disastrous. On the other hand, and this is where I don't think we disagree, but it's. I totally agree with what you're saying, and I totally agree with. Sorry, what is Yasmin say?
But pay attention, Yasmin.
Yeah. So
like we talked about.
So what I'm talking about is how do you organize it so that it becomes natural? How do we get from prejudice and exclusion and all the rest of it to the place where it is, as you said, this is the way it ought to be. It doesn't become that by being nice. It becomes that by organizing it and making it happen. And at a certain point, you get a critical mass and things change. And, you know, the police are trained differently. And the police stop being racist and you make a list of the reasons that you got the police out of their racist bucket, right? But it took a lot of work to get them from where they are to where you want them to be. And in all of that, citizenship is one of the zones that can be used to, you know, because people live somewhere, most people, you know, we belong to the 1 or 2% that might make the argument that we don't believe in borders. But for 95% of the population, they live somewhere. And they want to know that they can trust their police. They want to know that their taxes will go to public programming. And so that, it's not an end. It's not the end. The end is death, you know. But it is an element in organizing rights, treatment, inclusion, you know, fair education, fair health care. All these things come out of something. People being willing to pay the taxes that will pay for the health care. You know?
Right. Well, here's a question that I want to come back to later, so I'm going to let you park it. Is there anyone here for economic reasons, because we all have our flags on our little badges, is there anyone here for the reasons of economy that wish they had had a different citizenship? Because I'm a Canadian. I cannot work in the United States. I cannot work in the European Union. I cannot work in China or Singapore or Korea, where my ancestors are from. For economic reasons, that's a question I'm going to come back to, but I know Zabeen has something she wants to add to the conversation.
There's two interventions here also, Jacob and Yasmin.
All right.
So picking
Zabeen
up
first.
on this, you know, the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, the way that I think about it, I don't think it's not a hard line. It's two sides of the same coin. Prosperous economies are economies where the social health and the economic health are strong. And so where you draw the line between as a company or as a nation to really build, there's a culture aspect, absolutely, an inclusive culture. But what I would say is that we know that we've been at this for decades, and change is not happening in leadership levels. It's not happening that quickly enough.
Absolutely.
And so while I don't, you know, it's semantics in many ways, and quotas has, has sort of I think a bad rep in some ways, but I'm a strong proponent of setting objectives. If something is important to your business, you set objectives. So take growth, for example, and I come from financial services, so you have an objective to grow your mortgages. Well, it doesn't mean you're going to put bad mortgages on the book. It, you know, in some countries it may have, but, and that's where I go, you know, they say if it was Lehman Sisters, maybe things would have been different. But you have practices, you have checks and balances to do that, and you also have provisions for bad losses or bad mortgages, because not every decision, man or woman, white or otherwise, is going to turn out to be the right, you know, the outcomes for all of the leadership changes you make are. You could put a white man in a job and he won't be successful. And yet we worry about, if we set objectives, we're going to put the wrong woman in the job. We're going to put the wrong person of color in the job. For me, I can say unequivocally, the organization that I come from, had we not had objectives, even though we started with 30% women in executive positions, we were starting to backslide. And by putting objectives in place, you then put talent practices, culture right from the beginning, where you're identifying high potential people earlier. And yes, you are addressing some of the inequities that they may have experienced before. You are addressing some of the systemic biases and doing things to unleash the potential of everyone. So I think this whole sort of quotas piece reframed as business objectives.
So it's slightly different. It's on the move.
Yeah.
I mean, as opposed to quotas, which is like a fixed, static thing. Oh, you've got 20%, it's done. It's saying, oh, well, now we've got to 20%, now we want to do this, and then we want to do that.
Having the accountability in
You talk about this a lot. What do you have?
Well, I have an answer you said of how do we create, basically get from this prejudice, discrimination to a more inclusive society. Well, we all know how to do this. We just have to learn from our colonizers. How did they do it? Typical systems thinking. You know, race is a social construct. All of that what we were talking about was created. Yeah. This whole biological argument in terms of when you're born, all of a sudden because you were born a certain way, that's how you are because of biology. Same with the argument that men versus women and men's biological capabilities. No, that was all a construct. So we just need to create a new construct. But what's missing is that we don't really want to change it. There's a lot of people in the world that are not really want to change it. They want to stay in power. They want to maintain influence. But I want to do something real quick. I do want to, can everybody stand up?
Everybody.
Everybody.
I will call your name if you're not standing.
Stand up. I guess we are part of it.
So we're about to do something really silly, and then I'll explain why. So basically what we're going to do is at the count of 3, we're going to do something called a name game. Everybody's going to scream out their name at once. It can be your first name, your nickname, whatever you want to be called, but you got to do it loud and clear. Does that make sense?
If you have a mic, you don't have to scream.
So scream your name at the count of 3, all right? 1, 2, 3. All right, thank you. Sit down. All right. So, you know, you told us a little bit more about your story. And the thing, everybody has a name. The way they introduce themselves to the world comes up with a lot of weight based on their background, experiences, skills they learn. That's difference, right? And everybody, my belief is that we need to get to a point where that goes beyond the quota. People can really feel like they belong, they can thrive, they can feel seen, heard, and recognized. But to take it past that, I think, you know, data is a tricky thing, and I think there's a lot of scientists in the room. And that data basically shows that we all have a name, we all have a story. There is common humanity. I have an organization called Project 99, and 99 is based on the Human Genome Project. We all, from our DNA perspective, 99.9% alike, if we believe this research, and then also 0.01% difference. So we all have that little difference that's really powerful. But I think what can be dangerous is that you cannot assume I don't like Big Bang Theory. I like Big Bang Theory, and we have something in common then. So homogeneity can come, that word itself is dangerous. What you're saying is you're looking for folks that have common bonds. So to do those common bonds, you have to do the extra work of asking me, what do I like? Because you might find out that I like very different things than the perception and the bias that is out there. So I think it's all about how do we start more dialogues to get to know each other so we can get beyond these basic definitions of what diversity means.
We encourage dialogue. We encourage dialogue at lunch. Right, well, we talked about the privilege of English. I'm going to exert the privilege of hosting, and I get to ask the audience a question. Marty has someone over here who's my question for you, instead of your question for us, is have you ever wanted to move for economic reasons? Have you ever wanted to have a different citizenship?
Oh, no. I'm Simon. I'm from the Netherlands, so I have a pretty good citizenship instead. But it's a question now is about economic terms, but I think I'm gonna add my own thing now. You know, I think our current economic rationality does not support this whole discussion, basically, because we have created a system in which we created organizations called businesses that serve for the production and distribution of goods. And we have an understanding of business as doing production and distribution of goods and value creation. And everything we do here right now is a diversion from the question of the production and distribution of goods. So we need to have an understanding of businesses, not just production and distribution of goods, but as a sort of their own, just an institution. Every business is their institution that tries to create value for all people, and not just in terms of production and distribution of goods, but also in terms of inclusion in society, inclusion in differences in ideas, etc. And I don't think that works with a system that's now created towards shareholder value, etc.
Very quickly, to your question, which is excellent. Should businesses care more about inclusion and diversity? Just a show of hands. Agree, yes, they should care about more. Agree?
There's a question.
We're here, Yasmin. What say it?
I feel like it's a bizarre question.
Okay, tell me why it's a bizarre question.
I mean, I also have taken up a lot of space, so I think...
Over here.
No, I just wanted to introduce my story basically because you were asking about a person who came for economic reasons, who moved to another country. And I'm one of these persons basically. I'm originally from Russia and I came to Switzerland to study because during my bachelor in Russia I had an opportunity to have an exchange, but in Liechtenstein, but it was a nice immersion to European culture and another living standards basically. I came here and I'm very grateful. Like Swiss education is, I think, one of the best educations that you can have, and I'm really grateful for the courses, for the content, for context that I'm having here. But main obstacle is, I think, it's the legal obstacles, the system here, and I want to share just little stories that I'm now having challenges with. So. Swiss education system is very nice, but labor market is very protective in Switzerland, and being non-European is a very big challenge here. And sometimes I had discussions with HR and they would simply say that, yeah, you're non-European, so we don't even accept your CV or resume. And there would be also some jokes like, oh yeah, you have a solution, you can just marry a Swiss guy. And it's, it's like also so unprofessional from HR people to joke like that, to point it out. And I feel really challenged in this environment, and I know that education system, it's like government is really supporting all the universities here, so they're supporting others having education here, and then why not benefit from their skills and their talents from other students and from the diversity they have. So that is my story.
Great,
basically.
thank you very much.
It's actually a very similar kind of problem, really.
I'm going to go to the stage very quickly, but there seems to be a consensus in the room that the system as it is currently constructed does not work. Yes? Sure, okay, fine. Fair. Works for some people. So,
okay, so I'm the Canadian ambassador here, but I'm not speaking on behalf of Canada, please.
I would tend to disagree with the gentleman there who was saying that the system does not allow for a deviation from the traditional. You're there for maximized profits and just make sure your shareholders are happy. If you take mining in Canada, all of a sudden, corporate social responsibility became the comparative differentiator between a good mining company and a bad mining company. It used to be that social responsibility for enterprises was an expense. Now it's an investment, and it is a comparative advantage. People want to buy products because they are environmentally produced, they are fair trade, they have an employee base that is diverse. I think millennials here would tend to agree that they'd rather buy local than buy products that have to travel for thousands of kilometers. So I don't think the system cannot be modified in a way to meet the needs, and what in your equation you do not think of the most important person, the client, the customer. And I think that is who will dictate, and it's all of us, will dictate how businesses will change in the way they produce the goods and services and what they stand for. If you look at mission statements of businesses these days, they have changed dramatically from making money to actually having more social and environmental objectives.
John.
Well, I think there's somebody who is eager. Eager should be rewarded.
Wait, Aya for 30 seconds. All right, let's go to Aya.
I think we can go ahead with like case studies of different countries, but we're talking about a global economy where 8 men own equal half of the world's, rich, and we're talking about, in Africa, we're talking about a continent that is nourishing European economies, so we cannot just say, the system is open to inclusion when the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. It just doesn't make sense to my context.
All right, very quickly, I'm going to go to Maria, who's completely fascinating, and then to John.
No, I've got 2 over here.
I just wanted to add something.
I love it.
So in Pakistan, I see it's not that much of diversity. And everyone almost believe in the same kind of thing, belief system or same kind of thinking, or almost same language, same color almost. So it's kind of boring, and at the same time, you said comfort, but at the same time, nothing is progressive. You can't think out of the box because everyone is in the box thinking,
You're holding a box, Maria.
Right, yes, right. But at the same time, inside the government, we see the policymakers are also the same people. They can't think something different, whether it's our army, whether it's our government. They think the same way. It can be aggressive way. So, but when I came to move to Canada, what I felt that, what was more comforting for me, that it was people who were asking me that whether I want to live with the Pakistani community or Muslim community. They were trying to comfort me where I want to go. And the thing was that I also felt that there are a lot of people like me, and or from different backgrounds or from different countries, and I felt that I can be myself and nobody cares and nobody judge. And there was the freedom of speech. I can say anything, and everyone has to be listening to it and try to understand and be tolerant. And that was the same thing in Pakistan. It's the same kind of mentality. And if I say something now that I brought from Canada, they will just shoot me. So it's something very different because they're not accepting something new. So that was one thing that I felt, and this is from the government. You see there, inside the Canadian government, there's like Sikh, there's Muslim, there's all kind of people. So everyone has a voice, and nobody can. Everyone has to be careful and try to understand each other rather than just impose their ideas on you. So that's one thing I felt comfortable in Canada. And anyone can be themselves, and the law is so strong that everyone knows that his rights are secured, preserved, right? Nobody can step on it. So that's the beautiful thing about Canada, I felt. And we need, what I felt, that the water, when you see the water, when it's standing, it becomes dirty. It has to keep moving so it stays fresh. It's very important in anything, like business, a government, or anything. Other thing I felt, I went to Qatar last week, like 8 days or 10 days ago. And what I see in Arab countries, you see Saudi Arabia or Qatar or all those, they definitely have people coming from different countries and working there because the Arabs don't work themselves. They don't want to work. But they have this diversity. They have people working from all over the world, but at the same time, the citizenship is very important. If you're coming from Canada or Europe, you're paid more. If you're coming from the developing world, you're paid less. And if you are an Arab, you're priority. So I don't know where it goes. Like, how do we change all those things? Because it's the mentality, too, that affects the economics.
Thank you, Maria. And I'm just going to say, I spoke with Maria at the chocolate factory earlier this week, which is an amazing Swiss thing to say. She's got an incredible story. I encourage you to go find her at lunch. John, ideas. Is the system broken, and more importantly, what replaces it?
But I think I think it's you. I think that's right. I totally agreed that we have not at all cleaned up the act of the empires. That the empires only started to end, in my view, with what the Europeans call the migrant crisis, which isn't a migrant crisis at all.
What is it, John?
It's the beginning of the end of the European empires. And it's just taken from 1960 to 2015 to move from rhetoric to reality. It's a very, very interesting moment. You just can't listen to anybody in authority in Europe who talks about it as an invasion, because they're really talking about finally the empires are not working the way they want them to work, which is, they continued to control and so on. But I think one of the really important things for business and government and universities is that your argument, totally accurate, about this artificial creation of race as difference, as a form of measurement of superiority and inferiority, didn't always exist, is actually a fairly modern phenomenon, tied very closely to the Industrial Revolution, and tied very closely to things like the industrialization of slavery, because you couldn't have an there were always slaves, but that's quite different from actually basing your economy on the industrialization of slavery, which meant you had to define race. And in Canada, we're not innocent in that. I mean, Indigenous people, the imperial method, which was taken on by the Canadians, was all about, well, are you first, you say Indians and then Native and now Indigenous, are you 100%? If you're 100% blood, you get this. If you're 50%, you get... It's incredibly racist thing left over from the empire. So my last comment is simply this, that shortly after Darwin wrote his very interesting book about, it taking 10,000 years for the wing of a butterfly to slightly modify, the political people, false scientists, invented social Darwinism, which I'm assuming everybody knows what. Does everybody know? Does everybody know what social Darwinism is? I mean, well, Darwinism is theories of evolution, but social Darwinism was to take Darwin and say, well, we just won a battle against Arabs, therefore Arabs are inferior. It was a complete installation of racism into the methodology of the Industrial Revolution and Western democracy. We haven't cleaned that out at all. That has not been dealt with. People don't even know that what we're talking about today is social Darwinism. And it's disastrous. I mean, that's the basis of, racism pretty well wherever you see it, in the West, certainly.
Peter, you've been nodding a lot.
I nod to some of I call it the history or the theory, but what puzzles me in all of this discussion is a little bit, we are extremely good in analyzing what doesn't work. But at the end of the day, it starts with us. Not with me as a chairman of a company, no, with me as an individual. We need to start to move. And if we don't do that, let's not expect that the system starts to work, because what is the system? The system is the sum of all of us. So therefore, I think I'm very action-oriented, and therefore, what I can influence, I influence. I try to build something in a company where I'm involved. I try to do the same in Catalyst, because I firmly believe that the sum of changes we can do will get us to the right point in the longer term. Now, some will argue we tried that for the last 50 years, and the women quota in the US didn't move more or less at all, some other countries as well. But there I have to say that's where I differ from time to time with historians. I learn from history, but I also want to do things differently. So I would send back to all of you that most of your arguments are right. Now let's just start with yourself and start to actually take action.
I've got 4 interventions over here.
Does that mean you will start? So I assume that means
yes.
you believe in redistribution of power and wealth. So you could probably redistribute your wealth, perhaps, to indicate to the rest of us how it's done.
Yeah,
I want to go to the folks that haven't had a chance to speak. Tank, I see you. Ideas from the audience. Ideas on what comes next. And because I am not wired to anything, the closer I get to you means the sooner your time is up. So keep them nice, pithy, 30 seconds, and I will walk off the stage. Tank.
Sure. I'm glad you brought up the point of personal action. I think this entire forum has been excellent in trying to figure out the structural issues, but when it comes to personal action, we're using communication right now as a means of building to build agreeable standards. You know, we're talking about, oh, I like Big Bang, you like Big Bang, therefore we're going to get along. And I think we're forgetting the fact that the point of communication is to build understanding. Do I understand you? And if we can build that, then it doesn't matter if you like blue and I like pink or vice versa, because that is all that's needed. Let's look at communication as a means of understanding, not as a means of trying to agree on everything.
Thank you, Tank. Who's next?
And Scott, that's what I said right at the beginning. That's why positive tension is essential.
Positive attention, right here.
Just very briefly, I think that, in the debate, I think what becomes dangerous is when we no longer believe that we have the capacity to understand one another. Just because I'm not this does not mean that I can't empathize with what you're saying. I can't possibly be everything, understand everyone, but I think that our strength comes from our ability to empathize. I think that that's been a big theme of the conference, so I just think that we should continue in that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. What do you expect from me?
I expect you to hold the mic up.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. For some of you, you know, I'm one of the 5 founders of this organization. I'm very glad that it developed this way. And the managers, the professors, and the students participate across genders and whatever. One interesting thing for me, I'm probably one of the very few ones who grew up in the canton of St. Gallen and was the only Swiss in the 5 original ones. And for me, going to University of St. Gallen to school was natural because it was the closest university, not the best. But it has developed in the right way I wanted to. But the joke of the story is, when I grew up in the Rhine Valley in Herbruck, not far away from the family Schmidheiny, who founded also this center here, my father got the offer from the management of Leica, which is how it's called now, to go to become the representative in Rio de Janeiro, which was for me at 6 years the dream. And so I have, for non-economic reasons, I didn't grow up there. I grew up in St. Gallen and made a quite normal career, but very international. Thank you very much, and continue this for another 50 years. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to toss this back to you, Marty. All right, ideas for replacing the current system, and we've had 3 men, so I'm not going to go to another man right now. Celia, anyone who hasn't spoken yet? Right back there.
I'm next to you.
We'll start here, Mandy.
Yeah.
It's great, these swivel chairs.
I love them. I love them.
Thanks so much. I mean, I hear a lot about the good discussions today, and I think we were in our workshop. We were trying to define the word diversity. What is the definition of diversity? We asked Siri, we asked Google. I think this definition evolves over time. And for us, individuals or corporations, it's about getting up, show up, speak up, and really just to continuously make a difference, whatever that might be.
Great. We're going to go over there on that side. Marty has someone.
Glad I caught it. Hi, I'm Rocio Robinson. Thank you very much for putting this on. It's very helpful. I don't have a solution as to how we can change the system.
You have an idea.
But the idea is really to take action and take matters upon your hands, to do it. I was born in Honduras. I'm half American. And 2 days after Donald Trump won, I drove myself. I went to the Rathaus here in Zurich and applied for my Swiss citizenship. Because for me, yes.
Why did you do that?
because I have been given tremendous opportunities, and I thought, for me now, the next step is to see how I can also develop myself so I can make a better contribution to Central America, and I don't know about the US, but yes, hopefully there as well. So it's about economic integration for sure, but it's about political action, and for me it's very important to also have a political voice and to be able to participate and vote, and that is the power that we have.
All right, the last word, I'm going to give it to Celia over here.
So in Mexico, so an idea that we're doing right now, I'm from Guadalajara, Mexico, and we started, a lot of NGOs got together and said, okay, we can do a lot of stuff, but ain't nothing going to change if we don't change what's happening in the system, so we got to go into the system. And from within, so we started to do an independent candidate went up, and now he's part of the Congress. And he was the first independent candidate to get in, and now we have another 8 running for Congress, and now he's running for Senate. So from his salary, 70% of his salary, he brings it back to NGOs and to all the projects in society. 75, so 70%. So I think that also an action is also stop doing something. Like, it's not always doing something new, but like stop doing something you're already doing that's perpetuating the situation. So maybe letting go is also something that you could do.
Fantastic. All right. Very good. You know what? I'm Heather.
It's a
I'm
very
gonna
fast
give you
comment. It's a very fast comment because there's something easy that we can all do in the places that we are. You can look at me, you can see that I have privilege because of the way that I speak and the way that I look. And because I have this privilege, it's even more of my responsibility to speak for those who do not yet have a voice. So I think that for everybody in this room, it's an important thing to recognize that we're all born in a certain way, and some of us might have the cards stacked more in our favor. So there's a lot. With great power comes great responsibility, folks.
Thank you, Heather. All right, we're about 5 minutes away from lunch, so I'm going to give the last word to the 4 of us, or the 5 of us on stage. I'm going to start with you, Yulkendy. What's the last thing, the burning point that you would like to make around inclusive economies?
Yeah, I agree. And you were making a comment is not about us both liking Big Bang Theory, and it all goes back to perception, right? And once you're born, like as a little girl, you already believe you cannot do science, you cannot do math. So it's about how can we restructure our education system? How can we make sure every kid feels like they can really be whatever they want to be? Because right now we say we're for the leaders of tomorrow, but are we really paving the way for the leaders of tomorrow? Are we giving them the funding, the money, the resources to advance amazing work like you're doing in Africa with the Pan-African movement? Amazing work that I heard from all of you. We really have to put, really walk the talk and give capital and resources to your young people so they can really be who they want to be.
Capital and resources. Peter, something to stop doing or something to try, something new to try? What's your burning final point?
I think I did that 4 years ago when I stepped down from executive life because I wanted to give back and have more time to do some other stuff. Actually take actions in that sense, and I think I will continue that. That's for me is very important. The second one is I would urge all in companies, bigger companies, to not only think what they can do in their company, but also think about their supply chain and their customers. Because you have a snowball effect here, which many times we forget. So if I take my current company where I'm chairman, yeah, we have 150,000 people working for us. But if I take everybody who deals with us every day, I get to a few million. So if we can expand to that and actually start to bring them into, let's say, our sustainable thinking, for nobody the word diversity and inclusion, which I hardly use in the business because for me this is all about culture and it reflects society. Hence we do the right, we have to do the right thing on diversity and inclusion. But if we get all of that together, we can actually be quite powerful. And we underestimate how bigger companies can actually do much more on that side.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Zabeen.
So maybe one at the sort of systemic level and one at a personal level. In terms of the company theme, I think we're starting to see institutional investors, large institutional investors that are really paying putting a lot more focus on long-termism as opposed to the short-term orientation. And there is, I think, a lot of power and potential there in terms of really getting to this issue of more purpose-driven, more long-term focused organizations. At an individual level, I do want to pick up that personal action. Culture changes through behavioral change, and we all have more power than I think we do. This is a very powerful group in here in terms of really starting to change culture from the middle, from the bottom, from the top. So what are the individual actions that we can take? And one thing we haven't maybe touched on is the importance of language and the choice of words. You maybe touched on it a little bit in the inclusion. You know, we talk about a diverse person. I'm not a diverse person. I'm a unique person. Together, this is a diverse group. And I do not like the word tolerate. I do not want to be tolerated. Of course not. I want to be understood, and I want to be accepted for who I am. And that is the one thing maybe I would leave with this group in terms of the power of the words we choose.
Well, the power of words and the importance of language will form the focus of the 360 this afternoon, so come back after lunch. Last word to you, John.
Well, first, I must say that when I first came here, we had a very interesting meeting at the headquarters of St. Gallen, and it was suddenly pointed out to me we're sitting in Frederick von Hayek, because he was very class-oriented, library, and you saw that I looked quite startled. And I'm thrilled to see that all of these students of St. Gallen reject totally Hayek. I think this is not, we'll just be conscious about it. Everything Hayek stood for is the exact opposite of what's been said here today. So it's really important to be conscious. It's not an attack on the university, it's an attack on Hayek, who did a lot of, in my view, evil, frankly, to where we stand today. The other thing I was going to say is that, Mexico, to do what you've done in Mexico, as president of Penn until 3 years ago, I mean, I spent 70% of my time in places where writers and bloggers are killed and put in jail, etc. And Mexico is one of our big questions. And I think what you're doing is fabulous. But I think it's a really interesting step for people in NGOs. Because sort of 40 years ago, people in NGOs were created as I don't want to dirty my hands by going into politics. And by doing that, it actually left politics to the enemy. Right? It left this vacant hole, and you had coups d'etats inside political parties, and really the enemy took over, and the NGOs were left on the outside, basically the shadow of the real. And so the fact that you're actually going into politics in Mexico is well, first it's a courageous act, frankly, a physically courageous act, but I think that, you know, that in order to make the changes that you're quite rightly talking about, and you're talking about, it's going to be really hard and dirty work, and it's going to be changing laws at the local, national, and international level to make this stuff go away. And the only place where I would disagree is voting is essential. But what I would say, and that's the last sentence, is voting is the punctuation of democracy. The sentence is engagement, you know. And it's that engagement which you've done in Mexico, which is so impressive. And thanks to that, the votes mean something, and you can get some people in, and you can change laws and change Mexico. So that's a very, very exciting what you're doing. I'm thrilled to hear about this. I want to talk about it later.
Well, I would encourage you to chat at lunch. I truly do believe that the best conversations are the unfinished ones, because you have a reason to continue them. You can continue it at lunch. I would ask that you join me in thanking Zabeen Hirji, John Ralston, Saul, Yulkendy, Valdez, and Peter Voser. Over to you, Marty.
Thanks, everyone. We invite you to have lunch with us, and we're back in this room for another 360 at 1:30. Thank you, everyone.